Good evening, everybody. I am delighted to host this webinar, which is devoted to launching the volume Dispossession, Plundering German Jewry, 1933-1953. We have the authors with us and three distinguished discussants. So I will start with introducing the authors first. So Christoph Kreutzmüller is a historian at the House of the Wannsee-Conference Memorial and Education Center in Berlin. From 2015 to 2019, he prepared the catastrophe segment for the new permanent exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Since 2017, he has been chairman of the board of the Active Museum Fascism and Resistance Association in Berlin. His acclaimed study, Final Sale in Berlin, The Destruction of Jewish Commercial Activity in 1930-1945, was published in 2015 by Berhan Books. He then co-edited a volume, The Participants, The Men of the Wannsee-Conference, in 2017. He is an otherwise extremely well-published and well-recognized author. Jonathan Zatlin, our colleague, is Associate Professor at History at Boston University, where he has been teaching since 2002. A prolific scholar, he has written on topics ranging from the history of German communism to the politics of German unification. He is the author of the book titled The Currency of Socialism, Money and Political Culture in East Germany, 2007, published in 2007, which analyzes the economic and social history of the German Democratic Republic from 1971 to 1990. Currently, he is completing a book entitled German Fantasies of Jewish Wealth, 1870-1990, which analyzes how economic racism inspires violent assaults on the rights of ownership and citizenship. I'm equally honored to have three excellent discussants here. Professor Marion Kaplan, Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at NYU. Professor Kaplan is a three-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award for her books, The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Oxford University Press, 1991, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, Oxford University Press, and Gender and Jewish History, co-edited with Deborah Dashmore, Indiana University Press, 2011. Her newest book, Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, 1940-1945, was published earlier this year by Yale University Press. Happy to have with us Julie Keresztes, who entered the PhD program in history at Boston University after completing her undergraduate studies in history at Amherst College. She is currently finishing up her dissertation entitled Picturing the Nazi Racial Community, Photographic Practice, Everyday Life, and Mass Murder, which examines photography as a community building practice in Nazi Germany. Ana Maria Reyes is an associate professor in the BU Department of the History of Art and Architecture here at Boston University. An affiliate researcher at the Harvard Center for Latin American Studies, Ana Maria is a founder of the Symbolic Reparations Research Project. In 2019, Duke University Press published her book, The Politics of Taste, Beatriz Gonzalez and Cold War Aesthetics. Having meanwhile also edited a volume on Simón Bolívar as a cultural icon, Ana Maria is currently working on a second monograph, To Weave and Repair, Symbolic Reparations in Colombia's Peace Process. I look very much forward to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, Elizabeth, as well. Thanks for making it possible for us to have this conversation. Both Christoph and I are really excited to do this, and thank you to the panelists, Julie and Marion and Ana Maria, for joining us. I thought what I would do is just take a couple of minutes to give people a sense of the kind of intervention that the book is trying to make. And then Christoph is going to talk a little bit about the cover of the book and the photograph that's on it. So the book itself emerged out of an international conference that we held here at BU, Christoph and I, quite some time ago. But it was on an important and what we thought was an understudied aspect of the Holocaust, the theft of property owned by German Jews. In organizing the conference and putting the book together, it became clear that there are several reasons that people have neglected the procedures and techniques by which German Jews were robbed. In the years after 1945, I think one of the most important things was the need to reconstruct and understand the Holocaust. It's worth noting that up until very recently, Holocaust denial had an important influence on the way that people not only perceive the discussion among historians, but more popularly in the mainstream press. In fact, I just wanted to note that the very first conference I went to, there was a large group of Holocaust deniers that tried to bar entry to people like me going to the conference. So it's not been that long ago that establishing the facts of the murder itself, mass murder itself, took priority. Secondly, the technical mechanisms that were used by the regime to rob German Jews seemed too arcane to deliver significant insights into the nature of the Third Reich, much less the murder of Europe's Jews. Financial instruments such as currency transfer restrictions, capital levies, and blocked accounts seem the kind of topic that is really designed for specialists. It's a bit too boring for many people. Even though it's very, very important. But there's also a distinctively American aspect to this story. In contrast to Europe, interest in economic history among scholars in the United States is flagged. Now, it's true that enrollments in economic departments have surged. We see this at BU. But as Christoph and I saw when we were trying to put this volume together, the interest that North American scholars have in economic history is often quite limited. And given the enormity of these crimes, that's a very serious problem. Finally, where a lack of history in the financial history hasn't inhibited the study of dispossession, there are lingering concerns about confirming anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews and money. Although it's true that the Nazis were an exceptionally greedy lot and projected their greed onto Jews as they stole from them, I think many people have felt uncomfortable about discussing the property Jews owned for fear of reinforcing those stereotypes. And I suppose we could also add to this mix that the history of National Socialism remains a kind of divided study, on the one hand of the perpetrators and on the other hand of the victims. And this has perpetuated historiographic divisions between German and Jewish history. And so we were trying in this volume to, as best we could, unite both in order to make the business of economic discrimination an autonomous subject in and of itself. Now, when we think about the book, aside from the new research that's contained in the individual essays, and there are quite a few that are quite new, the book is designed to drive home one major point, that stealing property owned by Jews was a process, and a process that entailed depriving them not only of the right to private property, but also of their civil rights. So the book is about the link between belonging and belongings, between theft and murder. Now, it's worth pointing out that property rights in the Western tradition have always been connected to citizenship rights. That was true for European Jews. Before they were granted civil rights in places like France or Germany, Jews stood outside the social order, and that was the grounds for denying them the right to own property. But I think it's worth pointing out that a similar principle can be seen at work in the treatment of women in Western history. German women, just to give you one example, were granted some property rights in the late 19th century and the right to vote in 1918, but they were not allowed to dispose of her property without restriction until 1962, which is rather shocking if you think about how recent that was. Nowhere is the historical entanglement of possession with politics more apparent than in the institution of slavery. Slaves in the ancient world could own actual property, but racism and the demand for labor in colonial America reduced African slaves to the status of chattel, which protected slave owners from prosecution for rape, assault, and murder. But even after formal emancipation in 1863, African Americans were effectively disenfranchised by various forms of financial chicanery, including poll taxes and property qualifications. Meanwhile, more subtle forms of discrimination, such as redlining, have hindered the accumulation of wealth by African Americans at rates that are comparable to white Americans. So all of this is to say that the process of dispossessing a person is not simply about stealing from them. It also entails stripping them of their political rights. And that's the main reason, too, that we want to suggest that scholars adopt the term dispossession and stop using the term Aryanization. And it's not simply that Aryanization is a Nazi slogan that was used to camouflage theft and its political consequences. It's also that the term obscures the very process we're supposed to be analyzing, a process by which one social group was deprived of its political as well as its economic rights. So I could go on a little bit about dispossession, but I think I'll leave that for the discussion. Instead, I'll just give people, if you haven't had a chance to have the book in your hands, a sense of what's in it. So in addition to our introduction, there are 14 chapters. The book opens with a macroeconomic section, which starts with an essay by Jonathan Wiesen that argues for the importance of racial ideology in the despoliation of German Jewry. There's a huge debate on whether or not profit and economic opportunism or anti-Semitism are the more important strands that motivated people to steal. After that, there's an essay by Albrecht Ritschl that provides us with the first rough estimate of aggregate Jewish wealth in the interwar period. And the aim here is to deflate the anti-Semitic stereotype about Jewish affluence, but also give us some sense of what Jewish wealth actually looked like. And after that, there's a chapter by Christine Schönmakers on the German gold discount bank and the financial methods that it used to help the regime confiscate Jewish assets. After that, the book turns to another section, microeconomic concerns, starting with an essay by Pamela Sweat on the way that anti-Semitic ideology led shoe manufacturers to forgo profits and actually get rid of some of the Jews that worked for them. In contrast, Johannes Beermann-Schön's essay on the complicity of moving companies in dispossessing Jews argues that it was the profit motive rather than anti-Semitism that motivated them. And then in an essay on the financial sector, Dorothea Hauser uses the Warburg Bank to analyze the plight of Jews trying to flee the regime and Nazi confiscatory practices. The next section focuses on the wartime and the radicalization and Europeanization of dispossession. It opens with an essay that I wrote on the Theresienstadt concentration camp and Adolf Eichmann, who's the Nazi that Hannah Arendt famously used to argue about the banality of evil. Then Tal Bootman discusses French traditions of anti-Semitism and property theft in Vichy. And our own Christoph analyzes dispossession in the Netherlands, a country that was governed directly by German authorities, but that forced them to make certain kinds of compromises with local anti-Semites and business people. And Stefan Hödler writes about the theft of personal belongings of prisoners in the concentration camp system. The final section of the book focuses on restitution and goes into the post-war period, which is part of the book's argument. Benno Nietzsche's chapter analyzes how repossession, Jews who were trying to win back their property through the legal system in Germany, were frustrated by the evasions of the dispossessors and the difficulty of establishing the so-called real market value of the property they wanted to restitute. Mark Roseman's essay, in contrast, focuses on the experience of one Jewish woman who tried, without much success, to win back property stolen by her neighbors. And in his chapter, Jonathan Petropoulos analyzes the network of art dealers who had facilitated the Nazi theft of art owned by Jews and the ease with which these networks survived into the post-war period. The volume closes with Susanna Juban's chapter on the practice in Poland after 1945 of excavating killing fields and the way that what was popularly called post-Jewish property has come to represent Polish unease about the extermination of that country's Jews. So I'll stop there and ask Christoph to take it away.
And I'll ask Elizabeth to share the photograph we used for the cover. And I'm going to do that because we usually claim that photographs are to be used as sources and not as illustrations. And I myself have published quite a bit on that. And of course, if you do a cover, the publisher asks you, hey, we need a photograph that is kind of gripping. So you end up using a photograph as a kind of an illustration. And I want to counter that in talking a bit about this photograph. It was, and of course, nodding to Julie, who is dealing with photographs right now in her dissertation. And now this photograph was taken by an unknown person. We don't know who did it. We can see from the foreground, it was taken in hiding. It took us a long time to find out it was taken in Berlin. It was actually taken in what is now called Tucholsky-Straße, then Artilleriestraße, center of Berlin. And you can see a shop which is literally raided by people on that street, which is very like in the middle of town, really near the new synagogue, which you can see if you know Berlin right now with the golden dome really lit up. And it's so that you can see in this town center, this shop being raided, Jüdische Kultusartikel, a shop, yeah, really a mid-range shop that Leo Schmuckler ran in the Artilleriestraße. And of course, the people raiding the shop, and you can see, talk about perpetrators, it's mainly men, it's mainly youngish men, it's mainly not uniformed youngish men. They're not going for the menorah or the Jewish books they might want to find there, but of course they're going for the cigarettes. You can see several advertisement signs for cigarettes, and you have to know that by that time cigarettes were kind of rationed in Germany. So what is happening on the 10th of November, a Thursday afternoon, the cigarettes are ready to get an extra smoking ration. So what you can see is a photograph taken in what we in the book refer to as the pogrom, November pogrom 38, and in the Americas it's still sometimes referred to as Kristallnacht, Crystal Night. And that's one of the reasons why we chose that photograph, because it is an argument against Kristallnacht, because obviously it's not night. It's Thursday afternoon and everyone is there. And secondly, it hasn't got any shards. And that's Jonathan and I, we talked about that, and we really like that. So it's not this typical thing you see. You can, like a lot of photographs you can see from that day, from the pogrom, you don't see perpetrators on it, because they were taken after the perpetrators were there, because the perpetrators were of course dangerous. And this is taken from hiding, so you can see perpetrators doing what they're doing. And the last thing I wanted to remark on, there's two more things. One thing I wanted to remark on the last, but one thing is that you can see a bit of paper in the middle next to the advertisement from the cigarettes, the Uno cigarettes that everyone is praising all the time and smoking all the time, but like expensive cigarettes. But you can see paper being torn down. So what has happened is obviously that this shop had been raided in the night, and then the proprietor, Leo Schmuckler, kind of tried to prevent people going in and try to, do something about the shop being broken, shop windows being broken, the door being broken. So he put paper on top, and that is torn down in order to get in order to steal. And of course, the stealing is the plunder is part of the title of our book. And the last thing I wanted to remark on, that this photograph was then found in the collection of Heinrich Hoffmann. Heinrich Hoffmann was the personal photograph to Adolf Hitler. And for a long time, it was said that Hoffmann took this photograph. But we do know that Hoffmann at that day, on the 10th of November, was in Munich. And we do know that Hoffmann got interesting photographs from all over Germany by his party cronies, even by the Gestapo. So, probably he got this photo because the man or the woman who took the photograph was caught in taking the photo or caught while developing the photograph. And then he was given this photograph and it got into it, and he put it into his collection. And sometimes it's claimed that it was taken by Heinrich Hoffmann, but certainly isn't. There was no need for him to take something in hiding. After all, he was very close to the power. And that's why we took this photograph as an argument for thinking about terms, not only dispossession but also about pogrom and about the process of it is happening right there. Taking a photograph of a bureaucratic process would have been too boring. So and it's both bureaucracy and violence that did it. And we went for this violent attack on Jewish property, which you can see. Yeah, That's what I wanted to say about that.
We start with workshops with a lot of enthusiasm about getting together and celebrating the books, and then these stories kind of hit us in the stomach. But I look very much forward to these to these discussions. So we can start with Professor Kaplan.
I am looking at the Jewish side of it, and I'm interested in my new work on feelings and on emotions. And so what I thought I would do now was to talk a little bit about how people felt when they were dispossessed, when they were forcibly dispossessed. So the first thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was when Jews knew they were ready to leave. This is well before deportations, but they had to emigrate, and something like 2/3 of German Jews did emigrate, though not all to safety. They sold many of their possessions. So some German Jews, lucky enough to have sponsors abroad, sold their possessions under duress because they knew they couldn't take them along. And I'm going to give you 2 examples which make the point. Dismantling her home after the November pogrom, a Danzig Jewish woman wrote, quote, "It was so terribly difficult to destroy what one had created with so much love. My children played here and laughed here, and now to sell to perfect strangers." The city of Danzig dictated the price of her house and chose the buyer. She then decided to sell as much of her belongings as she could so that she could earn a little bit of money. Her non-Jewish neighbors came to her home and bought at cheap prices. And they complained of their plight. A pastor's wife insisted, "We're suffering as much as you." But the Jewish woman responded, "Only with the difference that you're buying and I'm selling." In Hamburg, another Jewish woman noticed that her ad to sell her furniture appeared among many ads by Jews. She noted, quote, "Yes, the Aryans had it good. They could now beautify their homes cheaply with the well-cared-for furniture of emigrating Jews." And she added, "Only the stupid among the population were persuaded not to buy from Jews. The others crowded the auction rooms, crowded our homes for the belongings of Jews which were to be had for a song." So that's the first part. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what this meant, losing your stuff, losing your possessions. Jews' loss of home and homeland also meant the loss of most possessions, sold for a pittance, as I just mentioned, or abandoned as Jews scrambled to flee. One woman recalled that one could, quote, "only set one's heart on as many things as fit into one suitcase." Like other middle-class adults, Jews had participated in a consumer culture, buying furniture and objects that helped them display their identities. In Berlin, for example, of the 1920s and 30s, Jews used home furniture not only to feel at home, but also to express similarities and differences with non-Jews of their class and region, as well as with other Jews. On the run, Jews could not take furniture, they couldn't take their dishes or their cutlery or other items that consumers tend to choose to convey to other persons who they think they are or who they hope to be. Moreover, objects have a chronology. They may not have started off as emotionally meaningful. For example, a few books one bought on a whim, but could evolve into stand-ins for losses of home, as mementos that evoke nostalgia for a former happier life. Hans Reichmann sadly wrote of, quote, "taking leave of his books." And then he added, "Who knows how, if we will ever see them again." He added, his furniture would, quote, "wander to strange owners," as he and his wife also wandered away. Maybe Primo Levi, stripped of every belonging as he suffered the torture of Auschwitz, best expressed this kind of loss, and I quote, "Consider what value, what meaning is enclosed in the 100 possessions which even the poorest beggar owns: a handkerchief, an old letter, the photo of a cherished person. These things are part of us, almost like the limbs of our bodies. The loss of home and possessions meant a partial loss of heritage and of self. So souvenirs from these previous lives served as a link to memories, since possessions also have a kind of biography, connections to why they were acquired, when, who bought them. These materials influenced their owners, evoking memories. For some, they aroused reminiscences of better times. For others, they provided a tangible reminder of family, helping them grapple with upheaval. Having carefully saved a towel given to him by his mother in 1939, one man donated it to a museum in 2001, so it would be a, quote, eternal reminder of her. The loss of these keepsakes endangered memory itself, so even minor losses hurt. So students who are participating today may want to think of something very important besides their cell phones that they would hate to lose, that someone important gave to them at a particular birthday or event, and what that means. Objects held symbolic meaning. They represented memories of one's personhood and cultural background. And I quote from one of the refugees, each knickknack, every book, carried the trace of a particular where and when and with whom, end quote. And when we lose or give up that object, part of us goes with it. One father, grateful to receive his daughter's luggage from Lisbon, left behind when his family departed without it, wrote from the US, quote, even with Doris's shoes and dresses far too small, we're glad just the same. I guess you know how one feels about little things, regardless of their monetary value. One got used to love them with all the big things gone. One woman, the grandmother of a colleague of mine, managed to hold on to what we might think was a small possession. Paula Zanmar insisted on keeping a black hat with 2 white ribbons circling the broad rim when she and her husband escaped from Belgium to Portugal. She often told her granddaughter about this beautiful hat. In late 1942, pregnant and with her hat in a paper box, she crossed the Pyrenees Mountains in the middle of the night without the proper visas, having to hide from Spanish, French, and German patrols. Was this a frivolous gesture? In the 1940s, many saw hats as morale boosters in difficult times. And in France, some thought of them as pièces de résistance, or resistance pieces against Nazi occupation. For Paula Zanmar, her granddaughter believes, it represented a remnant from her old life, with its comforts, when others had treated her as a human being. She couldn't let it go. Perhaps it also served her need to maintain appearances and dignity. She made sure to wear that hat for photos taken in Portugal. Yet, very, very few adults who made it to Lisbon in 1940 had managed to hang on to a beloved item. While a few had arrived in Lisbon on trains with leather baggage, many reached safety by foot, poorly dressed, and with only backpacks. Some lost everything. When a mother managed to get her son from Belgium to Lisbon with the help of smugglers, her husband embraced her at the train station and then asked about their luggage. She rested her hand on the head of her 10-year-old and answered, "This is it. This is all I bring you." So I think that's where I want to start.
So thank you so much, Marion. Let's hear from Jewry. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes or so is situate this book and the important research it contains within the existing literature on the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. That literature appears to be, for many of us, so vast and even so familiar that to think that it could overlook any aspect of the crimes carried out by the Nazi dictatorship is at first unfathomable. But the subject of this book, the destruction of German Jews' economic existence, has been largely uncovered ground until very recently. And in that sense, the book helps fill a major void in a body of literature that only appears to be complete. there is still a lot left to learn, as the essays in this book show, about the Nazis. Only within the last 15 years, as Jonathan and Christoph point out in their introduction to the book, has the subject of the Nazi dispossession of European Jews garnered scholarly attention. These historians and researchers explored the close relationship between the economic persecution of the Jews and the Holocaust. In Germany, as well as Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, robbery acted as a catalyst for genocide, accelerating the progression from legislative discrimination and terror to violence and mass murder. Building on that literature, this book shows how central economic assault was to the persecution and murder of European Jews, not just during the initial phases of the Nazi consolidation of power, but well into the Second World War, continuing at concentration camps, and even well after 1945, when the war ended and the regime had crumbled. But despite the recent interest in this history, the subject of the Nazi dispossession of European Jews, as well as economic discrimination itself, has not been fully integrated into the questions we ask about Nazism and how the Holocaust happened, or in general, how we conceive of the period as a whole. A glance at many general histories on modern Germany or the Third Reich, for instance, yields far too much silence around the matter. Some texts skip over the Nazi expropriation of the Jews altogether. Others relegate the subject to only 1 or 2 sentences, as if theft and plunder were only side projects for the Nazis rather than a hallmark of their efforts. The standard impression offered by many of these histories of how the Nazi persecution and murder of Europe's Jews unfolded is this: that as the Nazis consolidated power and capitalized on popular anti-Semitism, they terrorized Jews and stripped them of their civil rights, while their neighbors and colleagues looked on. They did so to force them into leaving the country, and for those who stayed behind, they faced deportation, imprisonment, forced labor, and violence in Eastern Europe and in concentration camps until finally they were murdered. What happened to their businesses, belongings, and homes throughout this process is rarely, if ever, brought up. And so readers of these general histories are left with the impression that the Nazis wanted little more from the Jews than their departure, and when it became clear that they could accomplish it, their total destruction. This book shows that this was not the full story. The Nazis and their collaborators not only persecuted, terrorized, and murdered Europe's Jews, they stole from them as well. These actions were rooted in the Nazi fantasy that Jews were not just rich, but they had become rich at the expense of non-Jewish Germans. And so stealing from them, from the Nazi point of view, was therefore tantamount to justice, or the right thing to do. And while ideology and racism shaped that theft and plunder, so did greed. And as the essays in the volume show, the economic discrimination carried out by the Nazi regime and its collaborators materialized in a wide variety of ways, from state-directed measures to ruses executed by the Gestapo. German Jews faced an increasingly well-organized administration prepared to confiscate their assets, made even worse by the fact that tens of thousands of ordinary Germans were willing to exploit their suffering. At every stage in the persecution and destruction of German and other European Jews then, the confiscation and theft of their property was central. Those who left Germany were forced to leave their possessions behind, only to be stolen by the state and redistributed to non-Jewish Germans. And in concentration camps and the German-occupied East, property was collected at killing sites to be sent back to the family members and friends who remained in Germany. Integrating the dispossession of European Jews into how we think, write, and talk about Nazism and the Holocaust is, it seems to me, essential, for economic anti-Semitism and opportunism ultimately made both possible. But it is something that remains to be done on a larger scale. Those doors are already open though. While this book in many ways breaks new ground, it also builds on some of the more familiar approaches scholars have used to understand the Nazi regime and the social and political circumstances that made the Holocaust possible. Two of these approaches address the subject of complicity and collaboration in Germany and elsewhere. One is the extent to which ordinary Germans were willing supporters of the regime. As this book shows as well, that was no less a defining feature in economic persecution. Former colleagues, neighbors, and friends actively profited off of the forced sale of Jewish-owned businesses and enriched themselves through stolen property and possessions. Another is the extent to which non-German collaborators helped the Nazi regime carry out the persecution and murder of European Jews. As a number of the essays in this book show, other governments adopted the Nazi program to exclude Jews from the economy and seize their property. State officials, business people, and civilians in France, the Netherlands, and Poland, to name only a few examples, all helped facilitate and profit from the process of plunder and dispossession. A third approach departs from the subject of the perpetrators and instead addresses the agency and experience of the victims. Many of the essays in this book testify to the ways in which Jewish business people pursued strategies of their own to protect their property and their livelihoods for as long as they could. Other essays demonstrate the post-war efforts pursued by descendants of the victims of economic discrimination to seek justice and restitution for the possessions and property stolen from their ancestors by the Nazi state and its collaborators. In short, this book builds on what we know to show us what we don't. Ultimately, it raises important questions about the ways in which economic racism and discrimination have shaped the past, and in doing so, raises just as many questions about how such practices continue to shape the present. Thank you.
Anna Maria, please. This was wonderful, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank Diane Caruso and Elizabeth Amryan for organizing in the Center for European Studies, and especially to Christopher and Jonathan for publishing this very important book. And I'm here, I'm very excited to be here to discuss, but mostly to learn. I'm not an expert in World War II history or the Third Reich. I'm an art historian who studies symbolic reparations in the context of the inter-American human rights system. And I also worked many, many years ago to develop the Holocaust provenance and the Holocaust era provenance project at the Art Institute of Chicago. So I have some sense of the mechanisms by which especially artworks were looted and then inserted into the market. So this is really a very important moment for me to be able to conjoin my field in Latin American studies on symbolic reparations and this subject, which has been so foundational in terms of human rights around the world. And so, we continue to learn from and stand vigilant against repetition. So I have to admit that reading the book was painful and difficult, of course. The history, this sort of very disturbing history, asks us to govern emotions that are very difficult to govern. But on the other hand, I do recognize the importance of this new discussion to understanding, and especially for building the conditions of non-repetition. Without really understanding all of these different components as to why, how the millions of people were killed and dispossessed, we won't be able to really ultimately guarantee non-repetition. So, I just want to say that, this volume really describes the entangled notions of economic motivations and fanatic racist ideology, the Third Reich's dehumanization, exploitation, dispossession, and murder of the millions of people denominated to constitute a Jewish race, was deeply entangled with financing a massive war apparatus and imperial pretensions. In the book Discourse on Colonialism, the Martinican poet and theoretician Aimé Césaire discusses how Nazi operations turned the logic of colonialism inwards towards a Jewish race or an internal other. The discourse of the civilizing mission assumes a superior race that is entitled to extract the wealth of a people through labor and resources. In other words, the savagery of dispossession of the European Jewish people is at its core related to the genocides of the indigenous peoples and to chattel slavery around the world. Dispossession, the book, brings to the fore this relationship and Césaire's understanding of racial constructions as economic and political tools disguised as a civilizing mission or as restorative justice. Indeed, the notion of restitution and restoration are key and problematic terms. The ideology that the Jews needed to pay back for centuries of economic gain at the expense of the German people grotesquely spins the notion of patrimony into a murderous tool. Indeed, this book challenges our notion and our implementations of reparative or restorative justice more broadly. We must be more precise about how these discourses can mask ominous machinations. And because I'm an art historian, I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the artistic side of this. But I do think that the book will open new avenues for research in history, in justice, and in cultural studies. In this case, Jonathan Petroblis' chapter on the network of art dealers operating and benefiting from the art collections confiscated from Jewish collectors gives us just a glimpse at the penetration that this operation reached in international commerce and the complicity in all the different benefactors. However, this discussion of the theft of art and other cultural objects does not consider important themes laid out very importantly in the rest of the book. For instance, the Nazi machinery amassed an enormous amount of what the Western canon would call traditional masterpieces, but conversely purged avant-garde art from its own state collections as a form of cultural purification. This is a key distinction that relates to the way we judge historical actors with our current hindsight. The Third Reich exhibited those works as degenerate art. And I brought some images. I'm bringing these images more for discussion if we want to, but I'm just going to point to them. A contrast here between two bodies of German soldiers, one by a Nazi sponsored artist Arno Brecker and Readiness from 1939, a idealized classical body of a perfect Aryan male body ready for war versus the avant-garde print made by the German artist Otto Dix of a wounded soldier as he was recovering from being wounded in World War I battlegrounds. So here you can see very distinctly, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Nazi views on culture, very much the idea of the healthy German body and the degenerate body, and those have parallels with the way in which the propaganda apparatus functioned. Excuse me, let me navigating a couple of computers here. So this also happened in spectacle, not just in individual artworks, but the spectacle of the cohesive, organized, healthy Nazi collective body versus the disorganized, hysterical, diseased, and degenerate Bolshevik and non-Aryan bodies, both of all sorts of non-European races and Jewish as well. And so the Third Reich exhibited these. By the way, they had two exhibitions, one on the German House of Art and the other one of degenerate art, but but the audiences of the Degenerate Art exhibition far surpassed those that went to see the German art exhibit. So the Third Reich exhibited works as degenerate art while constraining with their, while contrasting with their sense of aesthetic virtue, which often bordered on soft porn. Nonetheless, the discourse of superiority and degeneracy strategically implemented to dehumanize human beings was also applied to culture from non-Aryans and Bolsheviks. However, before destroying the degenerate artifacts, the Third Reich contracted art dealers specialized in modern art to deaccession them from state collections for specifically for foreign currency. Works needed to leave Germany, the degenerate artworks needed to leave Germany, the classical traditional masterpieces, the canonical masterpieces needed to be brought to Germany. So of course, this is a very important distinction that isn't covered by Petropoulos. And so the Reich contracted art dealers specialized in modern art to deaccession them from state collection for foreign currency. Works needed to leave Germany and needed to raise funds for the Reich. Many of the dealers that Petropoulos lumps as profiteers were in fact operating under duress themselves in saving modern art, avant-garde art from destruction. Notions of human patrimony operated here as well. They did not have our perspective to foresee how those funds would be used to set up a murderous infrastructure. Yet we judge them as complicit in the Holocaust, which I think we have to be careful not to just have an overall judgment on all these historical actors. So but nonetheless, there is a horrifying interconnection between what happened in the cultural sphere that symbolically rehearse the tenets of Nazi ideology. In this sense, Jonathan Zatlin's article that was the most eye-opening one for me. I'm a huge fan of Hannah Arendt, but like Jonathan, always felt uneasy about her description of Eichmann as this sort of yes man. In The Ruse of Retirement, Zatlin unmasks the Nazi operation as much more than just blind fanaticism. It scrutinizes the concept of empathy, so often invoked as lacking in cases of human rights violations. For those of us who have not studied the Holocaust in great depth, there is this general sense that the Nazis' dehumanization of the European Jewry was central to the collaboration and the complicity of regime officials. This evidence shows that empathy alone was not a determining factor. The Nazis created the illusion of moral authority, but were sinisterly scheming behind the scenes to benefit. This finding has tremendous impact on our determination to construct the conditions that guarantee non-repetition. This leads me to more of a question to tie this moment to our own. Given the rise of reactionary regimes that activate racial constructs and discourses of restoring greatness, what can these particular insights do into the European tragedy help us to act now? What do we need to identify from these many, many lessons in this book in order to stand vigilant and construct the conditions of non-repetition? So I end with those questions.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria, and thank you all for the comments. So I want to say a couple of things before we open it up to discussion. First of all, I love the sequence of the comments, starting with Professor Kaplan, who wanted to zoom into on the experience itself of dispossession from the viewpoint of the dispossessed. Then Jewry took it to the next level, which was to place the book in contemporary stories about that period of German and European history. And then Anna Maria brought it to the even broader dimension of what dispossession does to the art world. I wanted to continue this broadening of the discussion around the book by asking questions that may be difficult to ask in the context of a presentation by historians, because my questions have to do with the present time. And so Jonathan kind of allowed me to do this when he hinted at the experience of African-American dispossession, which is now fortunately a topic of great interest. I work at the law school, and that's definitely a topic of great interest there. But if we go back to Europe, I know that telling the story is extremely important for other experiences of discrimination within the European context. 5 days ago, we had a panel at this very center on discrimination, very different stories of discrimination of different groups. But through the differences, one could sense the idea that I think is central to Jonathan's and Christoph's book, which is the materiality of discrimination. And I find it wonderful and particularly telling that in this historical moment, authors of this caliber are showing this presentist sensitivity of talking about something that we are realizing has to be at the center of the conversation. And it's not just the materiality of dispossession, but the disguise, the creative disguise of dispossession. In different contexts, dispossession is called in different ways. Emigration mentions the book. Emigration is one of the most, if you want, sort of the sugar pill, the sugar coating of a dispossession. People leave, and therefore they leave behind their things, as if the actors of dispossession were the people who leave. So I very much welcome from the authors and from the audience their reflections on what telling the story now to European readers will do. We know how it is going to speak to readers, say in the law school like me, who are faced every day with the question of what to do about the growing evidence of dispossession. What to do begins with telling the story of dispossession and continues in the realm of reparation, which of course is a legal claim that the law has tools to address. Right? So I would very much welcome from the authors an engagement with conversations on reparation that are happening in Europe. In France, Louis-Georges Ten has been working on reparation for the African diaspora. In Germany itself, reparations for the plundering of works of art in Namibian museums has also been at the center of the conversation. In other words, one impression that I had while reading this book, it was not only that it was participating in the conversation by adding a story, but also taking from the conversation the echoes and the vibes that are around. The choice to make dispossession the center and the title of this book is to me a choice that both speaks to and internalizes the discourse of the time. I look very much forward to the conversation, and I was wondering whether the authors would like to briefly respond to our three discussants before we start taking questions.
Being a European.
And being the European and being in Berlin, where we will be opening a rebuilding of a former castle, which was built, which was destroyed then in the 1950s, and we open it as a museum to the not European collections. And of course, most of what we will present there in this house was taken, or was taken in colonial circumstances, and of course it was taken in circumstances which were anything but fair. And what we realize now, that it would take centuries, probably, going the pace we're going, to kind of reconstruct all the little and the big stories of mean, brutal, or kind of, snidey effects of dispossession that happened to get collections. We will then proudly present next year. But of course, if you go to the British Museum, you see the story of theft. I mean, it's built on that. That's Europe. That's the story. It's the colonies that made the musea in a way. And it's going to be a very difficult process to kind of get to a fair balance representing that, and of course getting to a fair representation of the robbed in the collections. And just as what Marion said, like, I found very interesting. It's, you know, I'm a trained banker, and I'm trained to see, to assess what the value of a certain thing is, but you can't, because there's emotional value. And, you know, like, what's a teddy bear? What's the market price of a teddy bear? So, and that is something which, you know, like, is important for the question you just asked, but that's something Jonathan and I were discussing a long time, how in a way you have to come up with numbers, but then on the other hand you can't, because market value of a teddy bear, an used teddy bear, a smelly teddy bear, you know, my teddy bear, I love it.
I just want to say a couple of things. Since I'm a historian, even if I was at one point a contemporary historian, I still feel inadequate to the task of commenting on the present. What I would say is, I'd say it a little bit differently than Christoph did. I think he put it right in front of us with a teddy bear, and Marion was certainly talking about the emotional loss of home and family, and all of the ways in which objects actually represent memories and emotional attachments to places and people. I don't think that the legal system or a kind of financial accounting is going to be able to restore, repair, pay people back, compensate. That's not, I think, possible. I would be a little cautious of trying to, I mean, I do think Christoph and I were trying to think in not being political scientists, but nevertheless trying to generalize a little bit or think about the concepts underlying what the Nazis were doing. And it's a period of radicalization and Europeanization. At the same time, there is this problem of dispossession. But as a historian, I'd want to insist on the autonomy and specificity of each case. I would be very uncomfortable trying to talk about, or let's say, talk about the Holocaust as an experience that can simply be compared to what happens to women, to African Americans, to colonized peoples, to what's going on in Europe right now. That makes me a bit nervous. And it's not just about the peculiarity of the situation. If you think about it, for example, and this is the specificity of the moment, perhaps, Jews, there are Jews still in Europe, but it's a tiny, tiny group. And if you think about Germany in particular, yes, it's true that some Jews from the former Soviet Union have come to Germany, but the loss of a large and, let's say, culturally distinct, religiously distinct group that had been very engaged with German culture and the German economy is not something that can be repaired. They're gone. And yes, there is this community that is there now, but it's a different community. It plays a different kind of role. And I think that from a historical perspective, there's no way to make good on that. And we shouldn't be talking about it in those ways.
Wanted to say, I really didn't mean to homogenize the very separate experiences, nor did I want to make the case that reparation is the cure. I'm thinking that for people who are busy with social justice movements, the focus on dispossession is actually crucial. And I appreciate the contribution made by this book to the body of literature that is developing from all sorts of places towards the discussion of dispossession and the materiality of discrimination. I thought it was a wonderful book. I loved it. So I have a question here that concerns the photographs There seems to be a central theme here with photographs, which I like. So it's by, oh, by the way, I wanted to recommend that everybody use the Q&A function to submit questions. The chat contains comments that we will certainly share with the authors, but the way to engage with the webinar participants is really through the Q&A session. Thank you so much. So I will start with a question on the photographs. Eugenio Menegon asks, what was the use made by both Jews and Nazis of the kind of photographs you used for your cover? And what happened to those collections after the war?
So it's a great question. It definitely depends, just using the photograph on the cover of the book as one example. If we can assume that the photo was meant to be taken as a clandestine act, as something that was meant to be hidden, then there's two possibilities for a photo like this to be taken. And both of those possibilities depend on who took it. So the fact that we don't necessarily have the information on who made the photograph means that in some respects we have to guess to some degree. So one possibility is that a photograph like this that documents the looting of the store was meant on one hand to simply document what this person was seeing outside of their window, regardless of whether or not they had views that were sympathetic to the Nazis or not. Another possibility is that this photo was taken to show a scene and something that this person was seeing, to show really and expose the cruelty of other people. So unfortunately, because we don't know who made it, a lot of that is guesswork. But private photos like this and many others would have ended up in photo albums. They would have ended up in some cases in correspondence to other families, in boxes. So there's a wide array of places where photographs like this could have ended up, and a large variety of the kinds of uses that people put them to, both perpetrators themselves and victims. For this particular photograph, I would say that it's meant to, just based on the composition, to show a rather startling scene that this person was seeing outside of their window. And depending on who they were, either try to show this as something that was morally reprehensible, or as just something that they noticed. Maybe they even took a picture of it to celebrate in it, to sort of glorify the scene that they were witnessing. So those are a couple of thoughts that immediately come to mind for the photo on the cover. And of course, we could do the same thing with any photograph to come from this period. Christoph, do you want to say a few words as well?
The startling fact is so that we hardly have got any photographs taken by the persecuted. So looking at photographs, we usually look at photographs of either like passers-by. I take it as Jewry, like to be someone looking out of the window, think, oh, what's happening here? Taking the photograph, or the perpetrators. More often, the nearer you get to murder, the nearer you get to perpetrators' photographs. And we don't have the kind of the gaze back. We don't have any huge collection of photographs taken by the Jews, say of the pogrom. There's a couple of, it's like two little collections where two young Jewish men, one in Mannheim, one in Nuremberg, they took photographs of their destroyed family homes. Of course, they couldn't take their camera out anymore. Like as a Jew in a small place taking photographs in a pogrom, no, you don't do that. So like we are missing something. We are missing the perspective of the attacked, and that's all the more why I was so glad about Marion, what she said, opening up that perspective.
So I'll read a question from the Q&A questions Q&A box. So it is from Case Van Stolk, and it is a question for all of the presenters. Why has the dispossession of Jewish property as well as the widespread institutional economic exploitation of the Jews, been understudied and or left out of the historical narratives of the Second World War, the Nazis, and the Holocaust until relatively recently? Yeah, I think this question was in part answered with the stigma that was mentioned earlier about raising the issue of possession itself. But please, very interesting actually to the authors. Why so recently?
There's so many reasons that this was the case. I think one aspect of it is the stigma, but I also think certainly in North America or the English-speaking world, I think that there's been less interest by historians in particular in financial issues. They're perceived as boring or as I was saying, arcane in a lot of ways. And it's very odd because, Marion, you're laughing, but I mean, I would say that our European colleagues, in terms of the influence of social history, that the part of social history that was about the social sciences continues to work through a lot of historians' work and research agendas in a way that it hasn't. We've taken a cultural turn, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I just think that there's something about North American culture in particular that has inhibited the interest in financial issues. And then on top of it, I think that and I think we see this actually in the chat a little bit. What became really important in the West is establishing that the Holocaust happened, that it was about Jews, not universalizing Jews, not de-exoticizing them, but not exoticizing them to the extent that they don't become German, but actually insisting that the victims were Jewish. That has been a really important aspect of Holocaust studies in general. And so I think some of the details then, especially about people's belongings, end up becoming less important because what you're trying to do is combat Holocaust denial. And I'm actually a little bit distressed that I see that there are in the chat, there's somebody who is making pretty antagonistic comments. This isn't about other groups. This book is about a particular group, and it's about the financial and economic aspects and how they work together with citizenship. And so I think all of these things together, there are plenty of other reasons that are internal, I would say, to the way that historians do their work, have made it only till recently. The final point I guess I would make is simply that when you think about complicity, to some extent it's about the international military tribunals and Nuremberg trials, but I think that there's a way in which establishing what happened focused on on high politics and some of the major actors. And what's interesting about this turn to economics is it shows, and I think Jewry pointed this out really well, just how broad the circle of complicity extended all the way down to people who could buy household appliances, as Marion was also saying, cutlery and things like this at cheap prices, and so became caught up in what this regime was doing.
And the last thing, it's of course boring, but it's about sources. How do you find sources? And many of the sources, the original sources, were destroyed at will by those who robbed. I mean, it would have been stupid to give those documentations into the hand of the Allies, because they might claim back. So that was burned. And then it's restitution. And the restitution takes till the mid-60s, late 60s. And according to German law, the files can only be opened 30 years after they closed. So take mid-60s to 95. And that was only then that those restitution files, many of the research are based on, were open to the public, found their way into the reading rooms of the state and cities' archives. And you can see that being used. Frank Bajor's work is based on that, for example.
So I have both Marion and Anna Maria who would like to respond at this point.
I was smiling because when I was doing research in Hamburg and the archivist took some interest in me for some reason, I was looking at Gestapo reports, and he said to me, okay, they were the most evil, but do you know the finance ministry? We have all of their records here, and they were the second most evil, and you should take a look at them. And I was so interested in daily life and in things like that, and not trained in economic history as I could have been had I chosen to be at Columbia, that I didn't look at them ever. And I kept wondering about them too. So I'm glad that this book came out, because it really does exactly that kind of work that the archivist wanted me to do. That's back in the 80s.
Ana Maria.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about restitution and reparations, because I think they're very important. And I think that this book does a very good job for me in terms of adding to the discourse of the distinctions between the two. And I think that Marion's intervention also, because of course you can't repair and you can't restitution really is to try to return something that, and so for instance in Colombia, and again I'm kind of like the odd person here because I'm neither a Europeanist nor World War II specialist, but in the Colombian reparations law we have the restitution of lands and the reparation for violations. And so what I think is really interesting is that there is like a legal mechanism for trying to reclaim or repossess something that was dispossessed, right? And so that's restitution. But the reparation would include the effective and symbolic loss as well, let's say, without, of course, the problem is the magnitude of the loss is one of the most difficult things to understand, because how can anyone even symbolically address a reparation for the loss of millions of people? And it's not only lives lost, it's the, what those lives would have generated. And I mean, it's like, there's just no way to wrap your head around the incredible absence. And so, but the reparations part addresses that, and the symbolic reparations is the one that's supposed to address the society at large. And so that's where museums and memorials and all these things try to and I know this is tangling in words like indemnizations and compensations, and maybe that's another dimension, but the restitution is a very specific part of having a claimant actually survive, right? What was an attempt to destroy, and then to have the legal framework to try to prove that they didn't sell under duress or that they were looted. So the reparations also has to include the emotional duress of the restitution process, right? So I think that the example of Marion and Strauss is so important for this discourse, because you're not talking about only duress during the war or the tragedy or the loss, but also the duress provoked by the very process of having to seek justice. And so, so anyways, I just want to throw that out there, because I think that, I think laws are evolving as we understand how much more burden is accumulated on not only victims, but their descendants in seeking justice. In the reparations, the concept of reparations in larger is conjoined in the inter-American system with notions of measures of satisfaction to the victims themselves, but guarantees of non-repetition. And so that's where it's really important to think in the macro level, because in order to guarantee non-repetitions, you have to be able to understand what things to be vigilant of, what were the mechanisms, what were the concealed operations, because without those, you cannot guarantee repetition. And as I think Jonathan was able to show that, performing banality, is just another master performance, right? And so we need to have all of these details in order to be able to, the true reparation is the perpetual guarantee of non-repetition, the perpetual building for that. And so anyways, those are my 2 cents on the reparations.
I wanted to say, Anna Maria, that was a great comment. Reparation as, if you want, the goal. I see restitution as a way, a building block towards reparation. As a lawyer, I know that restitution focuses on the enrichment of other parties and the injustice that lies in the fact that people who took away wrongly materiality that belonged to somebody else should return it. I see that as a more tangible and plausible legal claim that paves the way towards the recognition of injustice. So I very much welcome the focus on restitution, even though I definitely understand its intrinsic limitations and all the things it doesn't cover. I think it's a springboard, and an essential one. So Marion, please.
Okay, I wanted to comment on the last two articles, especially the Roseman article, because we're discussing restitution and reparations. And the one thing that those articles show, and I teach in my post-war course, is that no one wanted to give reparations or restitution. That's so important. The same Nazi judges were still in their seats, many of them, most of them. The same Nazi bureaucrats were still in their bureaus, most of them. And when Jews came back, as the Roseman piece shows so well, they were ignored, they procrastinated, they asked for more data and more information. And there's it's a pretty old book that was edited by David Bankier. It's called The Jews Are Coming Back. And it's essays about the Germans and the Dutch. And I remember the French one, I think, by René Poznanski. And in France in 1943, there was an organization formed by people who had gotten the property, the apartments, and the possessions of Jews. And that organization was going to fight for them to keep that property. So the politics of post-war were such that the idea of restitution came from Jews around the world, came from Israel, barely came in Germany. And if you know the history of even the German restitution law, it passes with a hair. So that in some ways we have to keep that in mind, that it took a long time. And people were just unwilling. I in my book on Between Dignity and Despair, there's this section here, the property of Jews wound up in neighbors' homes and government offices. When Harry Kahn returned to his hometown in Württemberg in 1945, he personally retrieved his property. A Nazi teacher's widow lived in his parents' house. The leader of the Nazi women's organization had acquired their bedroom set. Their rug embellished the town's revenue office. Often the bureaucrats kept the nicest stuff too. So another mom comes home to Leipzig and says to the local official, you know, people took all of our stuff and we want it back. And the official explains it would be difficult to find the pieces. And the mother points to the chair he was sitting on and said, that, for example, belongs to me. And she had photos to prove it. So people were not willing to give an inch, let alone words like restitution and reparations. Reparations is such a huge acknowledgement. I would say it took till the late 60s for the Germans to acknowledge. And then that still wasn't an acknowledgement of money, but by that time, some people were getting restitution. Very little restitution. Personal story. My mom graduated as a kindergarten teacher, never got a job in Germany because of the Nuremberg laws, et cetera, et cetera. And when she finally applied for a ruined professional life, she got enough money to buy herself 2 beds and a dress, and a what's it called, the board behind the beds. So that's restitution. And it sure wasn't reparations, but that's how it worked.
I have 3 hands up, and I would like to give an opportunity to Dorothea Hauser, Sheldon Peck, and Delheim. I think I can guess the first name, but I'm not sure. So Dorothea?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I was just adding to what Marion Kaplan just said. Actually, you were talking about not restitution regarding your mother, but actually compensation, I mean, in legal terms. And because restitution, the Allied restitution done immediately after World War II was actually quite effective. So, but it was legally bound to identifiable objects only. So the other things we are talking about are very different concepts. But I would like to go back to the question I would like to say what Anna Maria Reyes asked. I think the contemporary discussion on colonial dispossession, reparation, restitution, and Jewish dispossession is surprisingly unconnected. So I think that the moral force of today's discourse is often fueled by the idea of having somehow been successful with Jewish restitution or whatever. But in fact, if you go to details, it's lacking a lot, because I think the contemporary discussion, when you talk about Jewish restitution, it's always in legal terms. It thinks you have to prove, you have to identify. And so it's very different to doing things good it's clear which can't be done, but sort of give some sort of identification. I think the problem is that the idea in the present discourse on colonial dispossession is that there seems to be an idea of there is a moment of innocence way back in history we can go back to and we stay there. So what I think is lacking is the idea that things move forward all the time. And recently we had a discussion here with Bénédicte Sarrois and Felvin Sarr, who are of course terribly important in France, but also in Germany, in the discussion, and asked how they would think about the collection of African sculpture that was taken away from a Jewish collector during the Nazi time. And actually,
yes,
it is Charles.
It is Charles, I promise.
Hi, Charles.
Hello, everyone. I'm also having problems with video. So what I want to say comes in reference to art. And I think first, very briefly, I don't think you can compare the dispossession of art that takes place in Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe to other cases. For a number of different reasons. One, the importance of racial ideology. Two, the importance of systematic organization. And three, the Nazi belief that Jews had no right to the art that they had, that they were unable to appreciate it. Second, on the point of being careful of the complicity of dealers, I couldn't disagree more. If you look at people like Haberstock and Benland, who they are up to their necks in plundering art from Jews, buying art at fire sale prices, and working for the Nazi brass directly. And if you look at their documentation or at the OSS interrogations of these people after the war, this is very, very clear. Third, on the issue of restitution, I know that certainly in France with the Commission on National Recuperation, also to some extent in Austria, there were attempts to restitute art after the war. Part of these were connected with the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives officers, the so-called Monuments Men and Women, also with the OSS Art Looting Investigation Unit. Most of this faded by the early 50s, and it was more than 4 decades until it was revived as a problem to be solved and not just a story to be told. And finally, as I'm sure all of you know, there are continuing disputes over the ownership of works of art. In 2019, the Second Circuit of the Court of Appeals in New York heard a case, Zuckerman versus the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was relevant, which related to a painting by Picasso, the actor. So these things are still very much in the air and are going on in unresolved ways. But I think if you look at dispossession from the point of view of symbolic objects that were also very valuable commodities, you get a very different point of view. So that's in brief compass.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'll take another comment from Sheldon Peck. We are going 5 minutes past 4 because we started 5 minutes later. Sheldon, please.
Yes, thank you. I have a question, perhaps, that doesn't have an answer regarding the need for more information regarding the art theft facilitated by the border countries, such as the Netherlands and Switzerland. There were quite a few complicit art dealers and people in the art world who were responsible, as we're learning now, of taking valuable pieces from Jewish collections in Germany. Is there more information forthcoming in that area?
So we can have, I think, the authors maybe address the last 3 comments, and then we're going to wrap up.
Could I just talk about the very large bibliography on the Nazi loot of art and the art trade? And I just want to make, perhaps because I was trying to be brief, and always discussion is richer than reading a paper. But my claim wasn't that we should leave art dealers off the hook. Absolutely, many people took advantage and benefited from the dispossession of Jewish property, or I'm being careful not to say that word because clearly this book shows us that it's property that belonged to people that were signaled as Jewish, and right, there's a much more complicated issue. What I wanted to say is that there is a whole topography of actions that we can't just, and I was reacting to Jonathan Petropoulos's article, and he has a very large book and others on the subject. So I'm sure that, he just didn't have the space to do it, but there were art dealers that were deaccessioning works of art, some of them by Jewish artists, and a lot of them by our German artists that would have been considered degenerate. And that was like the whole gamut of artistic production, but primarily modern expressionists. And they were operating, understanding that whatever did not get sold for foreign currency to raise monies for the Reich would be destroyed. So in their mind, without knowing there was a final solution, before anyone knew what was going to happen, they were trying to save German history and culture, or avant-garde in international history and culture. So I just think it's my response is that there are some historical actors here that we can't just call profiteers, and so I feel like that's an important thing to differentiate, especially those who were deaccessioning states, because the state was deaccessioning its own collections in order to quote unquote purify them, right? To get rid of degenerate elements. And so that the complicity of the dealers and the deaccessioning of degenerate art is a very different, including Kurt Valentin, which I think was included there, Karl Buchholz and other people that then fled and were fearful for their own life. It's a very different thing than all of those other people that were actually working in a completely different logic, which was to dispossess Jews of very highly valuable in an international art market works of quote unquote masterpieces that were going to be amassed for German institutions or for Aryanized institutions. So so my response isn't to defend people that profiteered and that were looking for their own economic gain out of the suffering and dispossession of others. I just want to say that there's a lot more variation to that sort of blanket statement. And so I just wanted to say that. I'll leave it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria. So we're going to wrap up, but I would like to leave to the authors the possibility to respond.
Yeah, I'd just like to say something brief. I mean, you know, provenance is a really difficult issue. And as I think both Julie and Marion did a great job of explaining, it's not simply about the legal or the financial value that we would attach to these things. There's the affective value too. That said, I want to leave you with a very brief story. About 9 years ago, when I was in Germany researching this book that I'm still writing, I attended an art conference, or a conference actually about art, with museum directors throughout Germany. So these are directors who were in charge of everything from acquisition to de-accessioning pieces of art. And they were mainly smaller museums, regional museums, city museums. And there was this impassioned moment where somebody got one of the more important museum directors got very agitated and said, we cannot de-accession pieces of art. These people don't care about the value of the art. They'll simply turn around and sell them. And this is the German patrimony. So Anna Maria, I think you said it really well when it came to this problem of patrimony and the way that behind a lot of the rhetoric, there's all sorts of very problematic ideas that people have. That said, one of the things that's rather shocking that still lingers in people's mind is somehow or another that the people who owned art, or the people who have feelings about art, the feelings don't matter. What matters is the market, and that somehow or another Jews just care about profit, and they're just going to sell these pieces of art. And so Germany should not part with it, and that these museum directors are somehow the arbiters of that which constitutes German culture. And the vagueness of that which constitutes German culture, it's such an arbitrary way to define things. One can, of course, and they did very successfully in the case that I was involved in, do an excellent job of refusing to return a huge poster collection to the family, the heirs of the man that had assembled it. And it's just really shocking to hear things like that at such a late date. Thank you.
I really, really appreciate this. I found the book wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Christoph, for writing it. Many thanks to our discussants. Your participation was precious. We will continue these conversations, including on issues that were raised in the Q&A and that were not discussed today. There were a few. We will continue again through the lens of European approaches to what happens at different points in history and in different parts of the world to engage here in this discussion. I thank everybody, and I look forward to continuing this offline.